This is Prilosec, a brand name heartburn drug from Procter & Gamble that cost 89 cents a pill at my local pharmacy. This is omeprazole, the generic equivalent, and it costs 64 cents a pill at the same store. They're the same main ingredient, same dosage, same effect on the body, but the brand name drug is 40% more expensive. And if you price out all drugs sold in the United States, most generic drugs are around 75% cheaper than their name brand. And it has nothing to do with how well they work. It has more to do with the economics of drug pricing, patent law, and how the United States approves new medicines. But every modern regulatory rule comes from something before it, and the story behind the modern-day price difference was over 60 years in the making. But to really understand the gap in the price tag, we first need to ask, how can someone own a chemical? We need to get a few things clear because how Americans thought about drugs has changed dramatically in the last 100 years. If you went to a doctor's office in New York City in 1900, you might get a prescription for one of two classes of drugs: ethical medicines or patent medicines. Ethical medicines, according to the American Medical Association, were drugs that actually had a documented positive effect on the body. Back in 1900, that might have been quinine, aspirin, digitalis, or a handful of others. Meanwhile, patent medicines were super secret recipes known only by their creator, who was more of a salesman than a scientist. That secret recipe was usually a mixture of alcohol, opium, spices, or sugar. Not surprisingly, they were popular, but not great at treating disease. This is where the term snake oil salesman comes from. Snake oil was a popular patent medicine. And in this context, the patent in patent medicine is a reference to an endorsement as opposed to a trademark. Patents as intellectual property rights existed, but it was complicated for drugs. See, any given drug works because of its active ingredient, the compound in the drug that actually has an effect on the body. And back then, a drug company couldn't own the property rights to the active ingredient, but they could own the patent of their brand. For example, in 1899, the German pharmaceutical company Bayer started selling a medicine that contained acetylsalicylic acid. They took out a US patent for it in 1900 and branded the drug as aspirin. It quickly became one of the best-selling drugs in the world, so other companies would take acetylsalicylic acid, the active ingredient, and wrap it up in their own packaging. From our modern perspective, we know these as generic drugs, medicines with the same active ingredient as the innovator drug. And that was totally fine and legal. Bayer didn't own the chemical, they owned the aspirin name. But fast forward to the 1930s, and scientists were inventing more new compounds than ever before. Staple drugs like insulin, adrenaline, and some of the earliest antibiotics were all coming out. And if you were the first to isolate one of those novel compounds, you could patent it and make a lot of money. See, patents gave drug makers a short-term monopoly for that product. If there was a demand for a drug and they were the only ones who sold it, they could charge a lot of money since there was no one else offering a cheaper alternative. But back in the 1930s, this wasn't being abused. Like, while insulin pricing is out of control these days, one of the first scientists to produce insulin, Frederick Banting, said that insulin belongs to the world, not to me. He sold his patent to the University of Toronto for $1 so that they could ramp up production and get more insulin out there. The university later contracted Eli Lilly to make the drug in America in exchange for a year-long monopoly. That had the effect of actually decreasing the cost of insulin from 5 cents a unit to 2 cents a unit. And famously, Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, refused to patent it, knowing how much good the vaccine would do for public health. It was a different time, not just with ethics, but with safety. And over the next few decades, two big things happened that got the US to rewrite all the safety laws, both of which had an effect on drug pricing. The first was in 1937, when chemists at the Mesangel Company in Tennessee released an elixir that killed over 100 people. Yes, elixir was a real thing. The company was trying to figure out how it could tweak a powdered antibiotic called sulfanilamide into an easy-to-take syrup. The powder couldn't dissolve in water, but they found that it could dissolve in diethyl glycol, a compound that you might recognize as antifreeze. They released it, over 100 people died, and the Mesangel Company got in trouble. But not for the active ingredient. I went over this in my video about patent medicines, but the only regulatory law at the time said that drugs had to have accurate labeling. And while Mesangel accurately listed sulfanilamide, they sold it as an elixir, which by definition was a solution of ethanol. After that, the federal government realized that regulating drugs that were already on the market wasn't good enough. So, the United States passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which formally gave the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, some authority. The act required drug manufacturers to submit submit a new drug application, or NDA, before they could market their drug in the US. On this form, they'd have to include some kind of evidence that they'd safety tested their drug. Unfortunately, it was hard to enforce, and it didn't set up any kind of safety checks specifically for generics. Those could still be sold as long as there was an FDA-approved version of the same drug. Plus, there was a pretty massive loophole. If the FDA didn't respond to an NDA within 60 days, a drug was approved by default. The second big safety development happened a few years later, but I'm going to have my friend Mia tell that story.
The next big tragedy happened in the 1950s, when a West German pharmaceutical company called Chemie Grünenthal released a sleeping pill called Thalidomide. It was so popular that 14 different pharmaceutical companies got a license to produce it under various brand names, at some point reaching at least 37 different types of thalidomide on the market. By 1958, reports started circulating saying that parents who had taken thalidomide during pregnancy were giving birth to babies with various deformities, such as severely shortened arms, missing fingers, and deformed hands. In 1961, a German newspaper broke the story linking thalidomide to these birth defects, after which Chemie Grünenthal took the drug off the market and recalled it within a month. But the damage had already been done. Between 1958 and 1960, already over 10,000 babies had been affected by thalidomide, whether via birth defects or miscarriage. And so, regulatory agencies in the UK and in Europe reacted by changing their safety laws.
We get way more in depth on the thalidomide story over on Mia's podcast, Leechfest. Spoiler alert, Nazis were involved. Link in the description. Interestingly for our story, thalidomide was never marketed in America. Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey at the FDA kept denying the applications since she wasn't convinced by the safety data. Not by coincidence, she was also the scientist that found diethylglycol to be the poison in the sulfanilamide disaster. Honestly, she deserves her own video. Now, around this time, some folks in the US government were getting worried that low-quality drugs were being sold at high prices. They'd been working on legislation to tackle the problem, and the thalidomide disaster gave them the pretext to introduce it. It wasn't an antitrust law, this was a safety law, and it was codified as the Drug Amendments Act of 1962, also called the Kefauver Harris Amendment. The act required drugs to go through a rigorous testing process to show they were both safe and effective. This is where our modern requirement for clinical trials comes from. Everything from small preclinical studies in animals to longer, randomized controlled trials in humans. The FDA was finally getting serious about safety. But there was a problem. Between 1938 and 1962, they'd approved about 3,400 drugs based on safety data alone. So if they wanted FDA approval to stay consistent across time, all those drugs would need to submit entirely new efficacy data for their active ingredient, and that's a huge amount of work. So the FDA contracted the National Academy of Science to check all those applications through the Drug Efficacy Study Implementation, or DESI, and here's where it starts affecting price. This new approval process was way more time-intensive and expensive for the pharmaceutical companies. Before 1962, it took an average of 2.5 years to take a drug from discovery to full FDA approval. Afterwards, that process took anywhere from 7 to 13 years. So as a little insurance policy on their investment, pharma companies would take out a patent on their proposed drug early in the research process. And at the time, patent law gave a 17-year monopoly to pioneer drugs starting on the date when they filed the patent. Since the company filed a patent before they had a product to sell, though, the slow approval process wasted years of the patent term and potential sales. In 1973, economics professor Sam Peltzman estimated that the act prevented 25 new drugs from entering the market every year, and that the act caused drug research and development costs to double. Not only that, but the higher standards resulted in more rejected drugs. So naturally, way fewer drugs came to market after the amendments of 1962. Now, contrary to what I thought prior to researching this video, this act didn't cause brand name drugs to skyrocket in price. Innovator drug companies don't set their price based on how much they spend on research and development. They choose to develop a drug if they expect that they'll make more in revenue than they spent on development. So the Kefauver Harris Amendment didn't raise drug prices, but it did disincentivize companies from innovating new drugs. But remember, there was some antitrust regulation in the bill too. So to encourage competition and bring cheaper drugs to market, generic drug applicants wouldn't have to do clinical trials. The Senate thought that if the brand name companies were already doing so much work to show safety and efficacy, and the generic was just a copy of the brand name, then the clinical data should translate to the generic. they decided to let generic drug makers apply for approval with something called an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA, which was entirely literature-based. This meant that as long as a brand-name drug was approved, you could get approval for your generic version if you did a fancy review of the research. You can imagine that Big Pharma didn't like this rule. They'd already started lobbying against generics back in the 1940s, trying to convince people that they were dangerous or counterfeit, but they weren't trying to win over the consumer, they were trying to re-educate doctors. That's because the decision to prescribe a name brand versus generic was up to the prescribing physician, with all the biases that come along with that. And sometimes that choice came down to having a simpler name. Generic medicines usually had longer, more scientific names, which were harder to remember than simple brand names. For example, here were the name brand options for Digitalis in 1938. Ready? Digicardialis, Digicardium, Digidin, Digifol, Digifortis, Digigluzin, Digilog, Digiglutea Upshur Smith, Digiginfuse, Digipit, Digipit number 2, Digipura, Digiquin, Digirex, Digismith, Digitalix, Digitalogen, Digitalone, Digitan, Digitex, Digitol, Digitone, Digitora, and Digitos. These are the supposed easy-to-remember brand names, although I think Digitora is a Pokemon. And the abundance of brands put pharmacists in a tricky situation when filling a prescription. It was illegal in all 50 states for pharmacists to substitute a different brand or a generic when a doctor prescribed a specific brand of drug. So if the doctor prescribed Digipit number 2, the pharmacist wasn't allowed to fill it with OG Digipit. But if pharmacists could substitute, they could potentially cut down on both individual costs and eventually government spending. So in 1972, the state of Kentucky formally allowed pharmacists to substitute generics as a way of keeping costs down, and other states followed their lead. By 1978, 39 states had formally repealed their substitution laws. But that meant it would be up to the states to figure out which generics could be substituted for which name brand drugs, which is a massive effort. At that point, there was a ton of data showing that generics were effective, but different review committees disagreed as to whether they were as good as name brand drugs, which is the foundational assumption behind drug switchability. Some states started calling on the FDA to help, but it was way too big of a job to do on a state-by-state basis. So the FDA decided to standardize all the different equivalence criteria and publish all of the known equivalent drugs into a single source, the Orange Book. This would be a living document that kept track of all of the FDA-approved equivalent compounds, so all of the approved brand name meds would be on the same page as all of the approved generics. You can find it these days at fda.gov/orangebook, or as an iOS app that hasn't been updated in 4 years. So now it's the early 80s, and you've got this battle between brand name drugs and generics. Brand name companies knew that the market was about to get more competitive, so they kept their science as secret as possible because without research, generic companies couldn't file an ANDA, and without competition from generics, the branded drug could hold on to their market share for a little while longer. The big shakeup came in the early 1980s when Bolar, a generics company, started researching a sleeping pill called flurazepam, which was owned by a company called Roche, who you might know as the makers of Tamiflu. Even though the patent was still in effect, Bolar bought 5 kilograms of flurazepam, started researching it, and got to work on a generic version so that they could file an ANDA the moment that Roche's patent expired. Roche knew what Bolar was doing. It's hard to get away with buying 5 kilograms of a drug. So they sued them for patent infringement and won the case. But that decision had some financial implications. If generics companies couldn't even research the drug before the patent expired, the pioneer drug would still be the only drug on the market for the months or years it took to approve the generic. It effectively extended the patent for the name brand drug. Congress, always the defender of the free market, did not like this. The result was the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act, also called the Hatch Waxman Act, which passed in the House unanimously. This is where the modern generics industry really gets started. The act would incentivize pioneer drug companies to research and develop novel drugs while also incentivizing generic drug makers to enter the market faster. The goal was to encourage both innovation and competition through different incentives. Innovator drugs would be rewarded with 5 years of market exclusivity, meaning the FDA wouldn't approve a competitor or a generic version of that drug for 5 years after it was approved. There are a bunch of caveats and asterisks that influence how long exclusivity can last, but the point is, if you came out with a truly novel drug, you would dominate the market for years. One lawyer's estimate says that these periods of exclusivity can be worth billions of dollars. For the generic drug makers, the act kept them from getting sued while researching a drug still under patent. But now, as part of the approval process, they'd have to submit data showing bioequivalence to the pioneer drug through a small crossover trial. This was a way of proving that the reference drug's clinical trials actually applied to the generic, something that was only assumed up to that point. I'm going to have Salem, the other host of the Leechfest podcast, explain how that works.
The new standard used two metrics. The first was pharmaceutical equivalence. The generic's active ingredient has to have the same dose, form, route of administration, strength, and purity as the pioneer. But they'd also have to show that their active ingredient worked similarly to the reference drug once it was in a human body. This is called bioequivalence. Researchers would give someone the drug, then take blood samples to get a graph that showed the concentration of the drug in the blood over time. To be bioequivalent to the reference drug, the generic had to have a similar area under the curve, AUC, as the pioneer. This was a way of showing the extent to which the drug was absorbed into the bloodstream. And they had to have a mean maximum concentration, or Cmax, of 80 to 125% of the pioneer. This showed how fast the drug is absorbed. These small trials were more work than generic companies had ever had to do to get approval.
So to encourage more applications, the Hatch Waxman Act granted a 180-day exclusivity period to the first generic drug to file a patent after the brand name drug's patent expired. So for 6 months, they might be the only generic on the market and get a huge cut of the market share. Unfortunately, the Hatch Waxman has some unintended consequences. Number one, the first to file phenomenon. According to the FDA, the first generic competitor can charge about 60 to 70% the price of the brand name drug, but that price decreases as more generics enter the market. That's a big incentive to be first. The problem is that the FDA reviewed these applications based on a first filed, first reviewed policy. According to Catherine Eban's book, Bottle of Lies, this led to a weird Black Friday situation at the FDA. On the night before a brand name patent was scheduled to expire, generic drug representatives would camp out in front of the FDA with their ANDAs in hand, fighting to be the first to file. Naturally, this system was abused, like literally on day one. Bolar Pharmaceuticals, the company that triggered the lawsuit that inspired the Hatch Waxman Act, filed multiple ANDAs in November of 1984, every one of which was found to be fraudulent. I know it seems like a ridiculous twist, but when tens of millions of dollars in profit are at stake, it makes way more sense. After a few years of this, a generics company named Mylan started wondering if the FDA was playing favorites, suspecting that some companies were getting the first file position even though they weren't first in line. By 1987, nobody from the FDA was responding to their complaints, so Mylan hired a team of private detectives and found that some government officials at the FDA Office of Generic Drugs had indeed taken bribes to push ANDAs for some manufacturers and not others. All in all, 9 different drug companies were found guilty, and over 30 individuals were found to be involved. People were already hesitant about generics, but these findings broke any trust that still existed between generic drug regulators and the public. Sure enough, by 1990, it was clear that consumers were buying fewer generics. So in an effort to win back the public's trust, the federal government passed the Generic Drug Enforcement Act of 1992. It established a bunch of harsh punishments for anyone involved in fraudulent application submissions or anyone who offered or received bribes. One of the more serious consequences was complete debarment. You'd be forbidden from submitting any applications with the FDA ever again. So you lose your job. And that was reassuring from the policy perspective, but the FDA still had to convince people that generics worked as well as the name brand. From the very beginning of this law, consumers were skeptical that generics worked as well as the name brand. Remember, generics showed that they were bioequivalent to the reference drug based on 2 criteria: area under the curve and maximum concentration. The AUC is pretty good at showing the overall response to a particular drug, but Cmax was a little more worrisome. A generic could be approved if it was between 80 to 125% of the mean concentration of the reference drug. That means that there could be a 25% difference in mean peak concentration in the blood if you compare the brand name to any given generic. But what got people worried was switching between generics. If 2 drugs got approved at the far ends of the Cmax range and you switched between those drugs, you could get a much lower or much higher concentration in your system than what you're used to. So there was a worry that switching between generics would give you a big difference in peak dosage. This might be a problem for drugs with a narrow therapeutic index, which have a really tiny window between too low and too high of a dose, or for time-release drugs, which weren't as popular when this law was first introduced. But that's just for the active ingredient. The inactive ingredients, things like bulking agents, coloring, or flavoring, can be different from brand to brand. So not all generics are exactly the same product. Their active ingredients work really similarly, but there are some differences. The good news is that overall, these differences don't impact drug efficacy or safety on the public health level. This was one of the biggest questions I had going into this video. A meta-analysis published in JAMA in 2009 looked at clinical outcomes of generic and name brand cardiovascular medications. That means they took every high-quality study from the previous 20 years that studied whether a generic medication worked the same in real life as the name brand version. They found that each class of drugs had multiple studies showing equivalence between generic and name brand versions. Even warfarin, a narrow therapeutic index drug, was backed up with 5 out of 5 trials showing equivalence between generic and name brand. A different study published in the European Journal of Epidemiology in 2015 did a similar meta-analysis looking for any efficacy or safety differences in cardiovascular meds. Not only did they confirm that each class of drug worked the same, they found no significant differences in adverse events between generics and name brand cardiovascular drugs. But that earlier meta-analysis also looked at published opinions of generic drugs, and found that out of 43 published editorials, 53% expressed some kind of negative opinion about substituting a generic for a name brand. And that's one of the biggest hurdles still: trust. Even though there's a big body of science saying that generics are safe, people still prefer name brand drugs. And that's totally fine. I saw this a bunch when researching this video. While the FDA makes it super clear that generics work as well as name brand drugs, comment sections are filled with people's stories about generic substitutions supposedly gone wrong. Obviously, the comment section on a New York Times article isn't science, but it is a good insight into people's opinions, which we need to listen to when it comes to policy. And the message to take away is that FDA approval doesn't automatically earn consumer trust. As one of my teachers in high school told me, trust takes a lifetime to build, but a second to lose. So while Hatch Waxman put the federal government's stamp of approval on generic drugs, the system still hasn't won over everyone's trust. The final problem had less to do with Hatch Waxman and more to do with the world it was introduced into. By the 70s, countries around the world had revamped their drug regulation systems thanks to the thalidomide tragedy. But every country did it differently, so approval in Vietnam didn't guarantee approval in Venezuela. But pharmaceutical companies still wanted to be able to market in as many countries as possible, and doing separate trials to match each country's unique system was expensive and time-consuming. So instead of doing separate experiments, some drug makers would make up data or literally copy data from past experiments so that they could sell internationally. So in the late 70s through the 90s, representatives from regulatory agencies around the world started talking about using the same approval requirements as each other, what they called harmonization. From the FDA's perspective, this was great, since they were checking more and more international drug applications than ever, so they got involved in harmonization efforts right away. And they're still checking loads of international applications today. The vast majority of biologic drugs and a third of medical devices are imported into the US. As of 2019, 72% of active ingredients for US drug consumers are made abroad, including 26% in Europe, 18% in India, and 13% in China. Oftentimes, international drug sellers will seek FDA approval first and other countries later, since the US is the most profitable drug market in the world. Other regulatory agencies will watch what the FDA says and base their decisions on that. But the FDA can't do it alone. There are a lot of drug applications to check. By harmonizing approval standards around the world, you effectively increase the amount of people on the regulatory team. If the same standards apply to both Austria and the United States, it's like the Austrians are helping the FDA check their work. In 1989, the World Health Organization organized a big conference of all these regulatory agencies and encouraged everyone to adopt stricter, harmonized standards. And that's a great sentiment, but it doesn't play out in low-income countries in the real world. Despite efforts in the past, low-income countries are priced out from making their own drugs and are forced to rely on foreign donations for essential medicines, which doesn't always work out. So where do we go from here? As you're probably aware, there's still plenty to improve in the realm of drug regulation and pricing. Like, it still takes a long time to approve generics. In 2014, the average NDA for an innovator drug took 8 months to get approved, while the average ANDA for a generic took anywhere from 2 to 3.5 years. And that's just for the first generic competitor. The FDA tends to be a little slower for the second, third, etc. applicants. That's a problem because the newest brand name drugs have the least competition and can charge the highest prices. So to keep prices low, we'd need more generic drug applications and faster approval. There's also the problem of companies buying up smaller manufacturers and driving up prices thanks to the lack of competition. Go read the story of Turing Pharmaceuticals, who raised the price of Diaprim in 2015 from $13.50 to $750. It's gross. So while generics drive down prices in the long run, we need generics on the market for that to happen. Now, despite all this, consumers are in a better spot compared to 40 years ago. To put things in perspective, in 1983, only 35% of top-selling brand-name drugs with expired patents even had competition from a generic, and only 13% of prescriptions were filled with generics. That jumped to 84% of prescriptions in 2012, and as of 2021, about 90% of all prescriptions in the United States are filled with generics. While that remaining 10% accounts for 74% of all drug spending in the States, the overall pie would be hundreds of billions of dollars bigger without generics. So while every drug and every market is different, in general, the Hatch Waxman Act had the intended consequence. More competition translated to lower prices. And a systematic review published in 2020 found that policies that incentivize generic drug usage decreased out-of-pocket expenses for consumers. On the high level, that translated to trillions of dollars in healthcare savings over time. Side note, this is one of the reasons that the FDA maintains a list of drugs that are off patent and still don't have any generic competition. It's like they're telling the pharmaceutical industry, hey, these markets are wide open. Come and get them. The last thing that has me hopeful is that drug pricing is one of the only issues that unites Americans across the political aisle. And while we have different ideas for how to fix it, we tend to agree that prescription drugs are way too expensive. While there's a ton to criticize about the pharmaceutical industry, looking at how far we've come from both a safety and a price standpoint has me hopeful about the future. Before you go, I want to give another plug to the Leechfest Podcast with Mia and Salem, who you heard from earlier in the video. I didn't want this video to get too long, so I had to cut a bunch of stuff out. Luckily, we covered pretty much everything over on the episode of the pod, so go check them out wherever you get your podcasts. I'll leave links to their Spotify and Apple Podcasts down in the description. If you want more videos though, I've got a playlist of drug history videos that you can find here. Finally, thank you to all my patrons on Patreon. You can get early access to scripts and videos for as little as $2 a month by signing up. Have fun, be good. Thanks for watching.